Hey guys, welcome to the Out Jeeping YouTube channel. My name is Austin, and today we're going to be starting a lift series on this 99 Jeep Cherokee. Now this Jeep Cherokee is going to receive a 3-inch suspension lift kit by Rough Country, and if you guys saw in the last video, I got a little head start and got the front track bar installed, so we don't have to worry about doing that today. But today it's going to be part 1. We're going to knock out the rear suspension to get that all squared away. In the next video, you'll see how we do the front suspension. So let's get started and see what we got to work with. Alright, so here's the lift kit that we're going to be installing today. First off, I would like to thank Rough Country for sending this out and making this possible. But with this lift kit, it is a 3-inch lift kit for the Cherokee. As you know, they have a front coil spring suspension up front, and then they got leaf sprung in the back. Instead of going with the add-a-leaf option, I went with the full leaf packs. That way I don't have to worry about my old springs still being saggy. So with all the components in our kit, obviously we have our leaf springs, we got our coil springs, and then we got fixed lower control arms up front. This is going to help correct our caster angle when we lift the Jeep 3 inches. We also got sway bar drop brackets right here, so that's going to correct the angle for our sway bar. And over here we have 4 sets of U-bolts. Obviously we're going to be using one for either side where the leaf springs go. Since these Jeep Cherokees came with a variety of axles, they have a 3-inch U-bolt, and then they got 2 3/4 U-bolts. So if you have a Chrysler 8 1/4 rear end, like I am, we're going to be using these 3-inch U-bolts. And if you either have the Dana 44 or Dana 35, we're going to be using these 2 3/4 U-bolts over here. Then along with that, we got nuts and washers. Now as far as shocks, Rough Country actually sent me 2 different kinds. So we're going to be first installing these N3 series shocks, which is their new nitrogen charged shocks. And in the past, I've actually had a Rough Country lift that had the N2 shocks, and I really didn't have any good luck with that. A lot of times the seals kept leaking and they just kept blowing out just from daily driving, and I didn't off-road a whole lot. But they say all the problems with the N2s has been resolved in these N3s, so we're going to try these out first. I'm going to put some hard miles on the road and do a little off-roading too and see how these hold up and see how they ride. That's going to be in a later video. I'm going to do a review on these. And once we tested out these shocks, we're going to be replacing them with the Rough Country V2 monotube shocks, which are really high quality in my opinion. It is a $400 option if you decide to get it with your lift kit. But we're going to be testing those as well, see how they do on-road and how they do off-road, and then we'll compare the two in a later video. So a few other things that I got that I'm going to replace while I'm in here doing the suspension lift kit. One is I got new upper coil seats for the front. Since this Jeep has 300,000 miles, they're probably all worn out. Along with that, I got some sway bar bushings. I did replace these a couple of years ago actually in this vehicle, but they seem like they got some wiggle room in there. I also got some extended bump stops that we're going to be installing in the front. I got a video for replacing the rear bump stops that I'll post in the description below if you want to know how to do that. We're also going to be replacing the rear shackles that the rear leaf springs attach to. These ones right here are SKP, and they're the cheapest ones I could find. And I actually got them off of Rock Auto for about 30 bucks, and they came with 2 bolts per shackle, and then they also came with a replacement leaf spring bushings. So if these bushings and the leaf springs go bad, I can always replace it with this one. And also Rough Country also sent me flag nuts for the rear shocks. As you guys know, the upper bolts for the rear shocks like to snap off. You can pound out that welded nut and replace it with these flag nuts right here, and it makes it a lot easier. Hopefully I don't have to use these today, but as you guys saw in my rear shock replacement video, I actually got lucky with the bolts actually coming out, and I put some anti-seize on those bolts, so hopefully they come out nicely today. So with part 1 to this lift series, we're going to start on removing the old rear suspension and then replace it with the new stuff right here. Alright, so to start off on the rear suspension, we're going to raise this Jeep up in the air. We have a hoist right here, which is going to make things a lot easier. It's not necessary to have a hoist to do a lift, but it definitely helps. Unfortunately, I don't have really large jack stands to support the axle once this thing is up in the air, so a lot of this stuff is actually going to be lower to the ground, so that way my jack stands can actually reach the axle when we disconnect it from the springs. But to start off, we're going to raise it up so we can remove the wheels, and then we can also take some other components like the shocks out. All right, so to start off in this rear suspension, we're going to be starting off by removing the shocks. I'm going to start over here on the lower axle side. So this nut over here is going to be an 18 millimeter. I'm going to take it off by hand instead of an impact, so that way I can feel if it's going to break. I'll be able to feel that bolt if it's going to yield or not. I did put some anti-seize on this when I replaced these shocks about half a year ago, so hopefully they come out nice. Oh yeah. So it is still kind of tight down here. It's kind of hard to pry it off, probably because the suspension is kind of maxed out at the shocks and the weight of the axle and springs is on this joint right here. So I'm just going to go do the bolts up ahead on the upper side of the shock, and that way this thing should just drop out. So now for these upper bolts, they're going to be in 1/2 inch since I replaced these. If you still have the original bolts, they're going to be a 13 millimeter. So if you guys recall from my video on replacing rear shocks on a Cherokee, this driver's shock over here, one of the bolts actually snapped, and I just came down with a bolt from the upper side and then put a nut on the bottom side. And I just had to fish a wrench in on the upper side to hold that in place. So I got one of those bolts going on, and then I just have a normal bolt going straight up into that welded nut, so that one should come out nicely. All right, so since I got that broken free, I'm just going to zip them the rest of the way out with the impact. All right, now I should be able to wiggle this out, and then we got our shock removed. I'm going to put the hardware back in place so I don't lose it. Now I can repeat the process for the other shock on the rear. Alright, so the next step in the process is actually to unbolt the leaf springs from the axle with those old U-bolts that are on the Jeep. But before I do that, since I have to lower this to the ground and put the axle underneath jack stand so that way it's still held up, I'm going to go and see if I can break these bolts free on the leaf springs. Now, I had these leaf springs actually replaced before, and these leaf springs are actually pieced together, and they don't sag currently since they've been rebuilt, but basically I had brand new leaf packs on my silver Jeep back in the day, just stock leaf packs from Dorman. And this Jeep, the original main leaf, actually had a cracked eyelet on the rear. So if you lifted up the vehicle, the leaf spring was actually detached from the shackle back here on the passenger right side. So I got the main leaf from that, and the other leaves actually went to another friend's build because he used added leaves and his current leaves were all kind of flattened out. So there is a new main leaf, and then I used the rest of the other leaves that were on this, and they actually doubled up on one of the medium-sized leaves, so that way it doesn't sag. It rides a little bit stiffer, but I think it actually gave about a 1/2 inch of height, so it looked good by not sagging. I also just made some homemade straps too out of some exhaust hanger, and those have worked well over the years. I had this set up on here for about 3 years, so I've actually had these bolts removed, and I believe I greased or anti-seized them, so hopefully they should come out a lot easier. Now when we remove these leaf springs, since we got the replacement shackles, we're actually going to be taking the leaf spring and shackle out as one, so that way we can avoid this bolt right here, and then all we have to do is remove the bolt that's up here on the upper side of the shackle and the front of the leaf spring. Now with the factory bolts, they're going to be a bolt head of a 21 millimeter, so I'm going to get the breaker bar and see if we can get these guys broken free. Oh, look at that. That broke free nicely. One of the unfortunate things about these upper shackle bolts is that you can't get an impact on them because you got the rear and lower quarter panels over here. But over on the front leaf springs, we can actually get an impact on those to help get them off. I'm going to go around to the other 3 bolts that we're removing for the leaf springs and break them free as well. This bolt has actually been replaced before because I think we had to cut out the original one, so that is actually not a 21 millimeter. This one is actually a 7/8. Oh, beautiful. This is going to make things a lot smoother because this is the biggest thing on the rear suspension is trying to get these bolts off, especially if you're in the rust belt. They like to come unthreaded from the welded nut in the frame. Unfortunately, they like to seize up in that metal sleeve in the eyelet of the bushing on these leaf springs. So to seize that break free, it's really a relief. Oh, nice. And actually, this one is a lot tougher. I don't think I touched this bolt before because I think I replaced one of the shackles with another used one back then because it was so rusted out, and this one was fine. So this one might be the toughest bolt of all. It's moving, but I haven't heard it pop free, so hopefully nothing breaks. There we go. I got my jack handle cheater bar, so it definitely made it a lot easier. Why do you guys are probably thinking why I'm not using heat or penetrating oil? But the thing is, with these Jeep Cherokees, they got that welded nut that's located inside the frame, so even if you squirt out here, it's really not going to do much to get into that threaded portion of the bolt, unless you find an access hole inside the frame, which I think you can do in the front. You just got to know where you're heating up and where you're shooting that fluid, and make sure it's on the threads. All right, so with those leaf spring bolts broken free, we're going to lower the vehicle down so that way the axle is resting on some jack stands. We just want to put a little bit of pressure on there, so that way when we undo the leaf spring from the axle with the U-bolts, that way our axle just doesn't fall out of place. All right, so with our axle now supported with some jack stands, I'm going to go and remove these U-bolts. I went around to both sides and sprayed the U-bolts with some PB Blaster. That way it should be a little bit easier on taking these off, and if they snap, that's fine, we got some replacements. I'm just going to use my impact and see if we can get these removed. These factory U-bolts are going to have an 18mm nut. So if you guys saw in my replacement rear shock video for the Cherokee, I went and deleted the sway bar, and the only thing that was left was just these brackets attached to U-bolts. So since I'm leaving the sway bar off, we can just discard these that were attached to here. All right, so we can take off our plate that sits on top of the leaf spring. We're going to be reusing that. And then our U-bolt should just fall out from the bottom. So we got one. And then we got the other. Now we can repeat the process on the other side. Sometimes if you tighten them up just a little bit, it helps break that rust bond free, and then just back it off and then it comes right out. Now I just gotta move this broken sway bar link over to the other side so it's not covering this bolt. I just folded it down before because this bolt that attaches the sway bar is actually seized. It wasn't coming out. Alright, so now we got the axle 100% unbolted from the leaf springs, and we're ready to lower the axle down a little bit by raising the body of the vehicle up. That way it should give us some room to get this leaf spring out. Okay, so a couple things we need to pay attention to before we lift up the vehicle and separate the axle from the leaf springs. One is take a look at your brake lines, both your emergency brake cables if you have them and your hydraulic brake hose, to see if they're long enough so that way you're not hanging your axle by your brake line, because you don't want to bust it that way. If you guys watched my drum brake overhaul on this Cherokee, you know I already replaced this rear brake line with an extended one that's 21 inches long, so this shouldn't be a problem. Another thing to take into consideration is the axle breather tube, which is this guy right here. You don't want to put any tension on that because you don't want to rip that as well. And then lastly, if you still have your rear drive shaft hooked up like mine, you just want to make sure you're not hanging the axle by the drive shaft either. We're not going to be going crazy high. We're only going to be separating it maybe like 6 inches or so. Another thing is when we lift this up, the axle and the leaf spring are probably going to be rusted together. So you want to give it a kick when it's not too far off from the jack stands, so that way it breaks free of that rust bond. Mine's all rusted. So that side's broken free. We're going to do the same thing to the other side. That side came undone as well. And if you have the rear drive shaft hook up, it's going to be experiencing a severe angle. You just want to make sure you're not putting too much weight on the drive shaft, because you don't want to ruin any bearings or seals or joints. Alright, so I got about a 4 to 5 inch gap right here. I think that's plenty to work with. Now let's work on getting the rest of the leaf spring unbolted from the Jeep. Alright, so since we got the bolts broken free, I'm going to see if I can zip out these front bolts with an impact. I'm going to get an extension because this pinch seam is kind of getting in the way, and I don't want to strip these out by going in on an angle. Alright, so that front end is disconnected. Just keep in mind that this front end of the leaf spring is going to fall down just like how it did because it's not attached anymore. Alright, so I got this bolt this far out off camera, and I'm just going to finish it up the rest of the way so we can remove this side leaf spring. You can tell this bolt is kind of seized in that bushing that's in the shackle, because when I pull this back, it kind of feels like it's spring loaded, so that sleeve is actually kind of seized to the bolt. But with it popping out like this, hopefully it should just keep coming and we'll get this out of here. Alright, got that bolt out. Now we should be able to take our leaf spring and remove it. Alright, so same thing on the other side. We're going to be removing the front, and I'm going to zip that out with an impact. Just going to put a hand under here because this is going to fall. And I did put grease on these bolts about 4 years ago, and look at that. Through 4 Wisconsin winters, and the grease is still on this one. Then we can get this last bolt over here. Alright, that bolt is out, and now this leaf spring is free. Alright, so we're about halfway through the rear lift install. We got everything removed from the old suspension, and now we're ready to put on the new stuff. So basically the hard part's over, especially if you have seized up leaf spring bushings. So I'm going to start off by installing our new shackles, and these are just factory replacement ones. Like I said earlier, I got these off Rock Auto for about 30 bucks, and what's really nice is that they came with the factory metric hardware. And if you guys know, with these leaf spring bolts, you can't really get them at any hardware store because of the length and the thread pitch on them. They just don't come in that size, so you might have to go to Fastenal or something like that and get them. And they're a little bit harder since they are a flange bolt. So the fact that these shackles are 30 bucks, came with a shackle, 2 bolts and nuts, and a replacement leaf spring bushing, it was a great deal for me. So before I install these new shackles, one thing I'm going to do, as you guys know, is put anti-seize on everything inside these metal sleeves, on our bushings, on the bolts, and even the threads that are on the Jeep. So I'm going to go and do that for both sides, and I'm going to do it on the holes for the leaf springs as well, so that way it's ready to go. Now when we install these shackles, we want to make sure that when we install it, the welded side over here where the eyelet is facing towards the rear of the vehicle. And as you can see with the shackle, it's kind of pitched back a little bit. So we're going to install it this way with the back of the vehicle, that way on both sides. Alright, so everything's got anti-seize on where the bolts are going to go, so we can reinstall our new shackles. Make sure you got it installed the right way with the weld towards the back, and that way the shackle will be kind of leaning towards the back. Alright, so now I'm going to tighten up this bolt right here. I'm not going to go all the way, but tighten it off enough so that way I can still move it freely by hand. Alright, so I got a little tension on it, but I can still move it freely by hand. So I'm just going to leave that there, and we'll take care of the other side and do the same thing. Alright, so now we can install our new leaf springs, and the bigger eyelet that's on the leaf spring is going to be facing towards the front of the vehicle, and the smaller one is going to be over here bolted to the shackle. So I'm just going to weave our new spring in here. This is where it helps if you have a friend that can help lift it up while you line up the bolt, but I'm just going to set it down on the axle here and line up the back first, and then we'll get to the front. And since we got new bolts for the back here, I'm going to use the other new bolt to attach a leaf spring, and then on the front we're going to reuse our factory hardware for the front mounting. And then we just got a nut we'll put over here. Alright, so I'm going to begin tightening these 2 bolts that I just installed. I'm not going to crank them down and torque them yet until we get the full weight of the vehicle on the springs over here, so that way we don't have any premature wear on our bushings. So on these newer bolts, what's kind of weird is that the bolt head is actually an 18 millimeter and the nut is actually a 21 millimeter. So if you get these shackles, that's what you're going to need to tighten these down. Alright, so with this leaf spring installed, we can go and install the other side. It's going to be the exact same procedure. we'll slide in our rear bolt, and then I will slide in the front one. Alright, so with our leaf springs installed, we can begin bolting the axle back onto the leaf springs. So I'm going to lower the Jeep down back onto the axle, and we'll get it lined up with the leaf spring, and now we can install our U-bolts. So with bolting the axle back onto the leaf spring, one thing we have to pay attention to is lining up the pin that's on the bottom of the leaf spring into the leaf spring perch that has a hole right here. So we're going to lower down a little bit at a time and then kind of shift the axle by hand and make sure everything lines up, and then we'll let it down a little bit more until we have full contact between the leaf spring and the leaf spring perch on the axle. Everything's looking pretty good so far, so we'll keep going. Alright, so I got the other side locked into place with that pin. I'm just going to do the same thing over here. Alright, so that locked in. I'm going to lower the Jeep a little bit more so we have a little bit more compression on the springs, and then we'll install our U-bolts. Alright, so for installing our U-bolts, we're going to take our plate and put it back on top of the leaf spring here. As you can see, it's not really flat because this hole right here where the center pin for the leaf spring is mounted, this nut is actually a little bit too wide for this hole. So I'm going to enlarge in this hole a little bit so that way this thing sits nice and flush on top of the leaf spring. Alright, so I went and got that center hole drilled out on this plate right here. Unfortunately, I didn't have a big enough drill bit, so I just used a 1/2 inch and kind of walled it out ever so slightly, and then give it a few taps, and now it's sitting flush on top of the leaf spring right here. So now we can take our 3-inch U-bolts. Since this is a Chrysler 8 1/4 axle in the rear here, it has a 3-inch axle tube, so we're going to be using our 3-inch U-bolts. Now we're going to feed them through underneath on the front side over here. It's just going to wrap around the axle in front of the leaf spring. And if the holes don't line up, you might have to compress the U-bolt a little bit to make sure it lines up in the hole. And we're going to do the same thing with this other U-bolt, except for on the back one over here, they're going to have to go through a little axis hole that's built into this lower shock mount on the axle. Alright, so with the U-bolts up into their place, we're going to take a washer and put it on each of the bolts. And then we'll take our nuts and thread them on. Now I'm just going to zip down these nuts real quick. I'm not going to tighten up all the way yet till you get both sides done. While you're doing this, you want to take a look from the back side of the vehicle. Look up at the U-bolts, make sure they're nice and perpendicular to the axle tube. You don't want them to be on any weird angle. You just want them to be nice and straight up and down. And these nuts right here, they're going to be a 3/4. Alright, so I'm going to leave it at that for now, and we're going to go and do the same thing on the other side. So same thing on this side, we got our plate, then we'll take our U-bolts and feed them into place. Alright, so with our U-bolts installed on both sides, we can go and raise up the rest of the Jeep so that way all the axle weight is on these U-bolts, and that way we won't have any weird shift going on when we finally torque these down, so that way everything should be nice and square with the leaf springs and the axle. So I'm going to go and lift up the Jeep right now, and then we can torque these down. Alright, so with the Jeep up in the air again, I'm going to go and finish tightening up all the U-bolts up here. Basically, I'm just going to go by hand and make sure I tighten up every bolt equally, so that way there's an equal amount of thread sticking up on every one of them. And then we're going to torque it down to a final torque spec of 55 foot-pounds. And Rough Country recommends after you put on 50 miles on your new suspension that you go and retorque all the bolts that we're going to be basically taking apart and putting back on, especially with these U-bolts, because these guys stretch like crazy, especially if they're brand new. So these are going to be something that we're going to have to come back to after 50 miles and retorque them back down to 55 foot-pounds. All right, so with this side all torqued down, let's go and do the same thing on the other side. All right, so with all of our U-bolts torqued down, we are ready to install our shocks, and that's going to be the last components that we have to install for the rear suspension. All right, so for installing these rear shocks, I'm going to start over here on the passenger side, and I'm going to start by bolting it up to the Jeep up here on the top side, cutting the strap that's around this, and then it's going to extend down, then we can slip it down here onto the axle side. A lot of people actually like doing it the opposite way, but I found out with these nitrogen charged shocks, it's kind of hard to move it. If it gets up in there and you don't get it quite in place, then it's kind of hard to line up the holes. So I'm just going to do it this way, get those 2 bolts in, and then we'll extend it out and hook it up here, down here on the axle. So I went and reapplied some anti-seize to the bolts and to the welded nut that's in the Jeep side. So we're ready to install our new shocks. All right, so once I got those in by hand, I'm just going to snug them up with a ratchet. Now for this bottom axle mount, I went and put some grease over here where the bushing for the shock is going to be riding on, and put a little bit in the bushing hole because this is a moving point in the suspension and we don't want our bushings to wear out right away. So I'm going to cut the strap holding the tension on the shock, and then we'll try and slip it over here. And then I'm just going to put a little anti-seize on these threads. Got our washer, our nut, and then we can snug this nut down. All right, and that shock is installed. Now we can do the same thing on our last shock on the other side. All right, and that's it for the shocks. All right guys, that's it for the rear suspension. We got everything all bolted in nicely. The only thing I didn't do is torque down the leaf spring bolts. That's because I want to do it when everything is back down on the ground, but I'm not going to do it in this video because we still have the front lift to get installed, and that's going to be in the next video. But if you guys aren't going to stick around and want to know the torque specs for the springs, on the front eyelets of the springs, they're going to be 115 foot-pounds, and then over here on the rear, both rear bolts for each side are going to be 80 foot-pounds. So you want to torque those down when the Jeep is back on its full weight. That way everything is compressed in the suspension, and that way you don't have any premature wear on your bushings. But other than that, I want to thank Rough Country for sending out this lift kit once again, help make these videos possible. In the next video, we're going to knock out the front suspension and get this thing back on its wheels. So if you guys found this video helpful, make sure to like and subscribe to the Out Jeeping YouTube channel, where you can find more how-to videos on automotive and Jeep related stuff, as well as wheeling adventures. If you guys want to help support the channel, I got some Out Jeeping decals you guys can purchase over on Etsy. I'll leave the link below where you can find that as well. I'll also leave links down below for all the suspension components I installed today, as well as the front lift that I'm going to be installing in the next video. And if you guys are wondering about what wheels and tires I'm going to be putting on this, it's currently in the works. I'm thinking about a 31-inch tire at 32. I'm not going to be trimming a whole bunch of fenders or anything like that. I want to give this Jeep a nice clean look, even though it is pretty rusty, but that's this summer's work on replacing all the rusted out stuff. But if you guys have any wheel and tire combos in mind, you can comment that below. If you guys have any questions or comments, please comment below and I'll be happy to answer. I want to thank you guys one more time for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next how-to.